Okay, so as we move up the ladder of misinference, we start with a statement and we go up to a fact and then we go up to data. Once we have data, why is data not evidence?
So you might think, well, if the solution is not to look at a select example, then why don't we get data, which is the full sample, the full picture, the companies that started with Y and the companies that did not? Well, the issue here is that you may have a strong correlation, but it's not causation. There could be multiple explanations for the finding. So let's say in general, what we find is that companies with a purpose statement, a Y, do tend to be successful. And we've done this, we found this link looking at hundreds or thousands of companies. But is it that having a why leads to success? Or is it once you're successful, you have the time and headspace to come up with a purpose statement because you're not firefighting? Or is it a third factor causes both? A great CEO causes good performance. A great CEO comes up with a purpose statement, but there's no direct link between the two. And so why do I call this misstep data is not evidence? It may not be conclusive, because what is the difference between data and evidence? We often hear these terms interchangeably, but what is evidence? Now we hear evidence in the context of a criminal trial. Evidence is evidence that points to one particular suspect. If the evidence suggests that Tom or Dick or Harry could have killed Sarah, that is not evidence. It's consistent with multiple explanations. So what we would want to move from data to evidence is not just a correlation, which has multiple interpretations, but something which may be causation, a way of ruling out. Is it success that leads to a Y, or is it good management that leads to both? But again, if we have confirmation bias with a side of a nice narrative, then we latch onto the causal explanation, which is the Y leads to success.
Hmm. How big of a problem is data mining in research, generally speaking?
It's a huge problem. And so data mining, this is a different issue from correlation versus causation. This is the problem that there might not even be a correlation to begin with. Why? Because you've fished for it, you've mined for it. And so what do I mean by this? Again, let me give an example. So let's say I want to link sustainability and financial performance. Well, there's so many ways I could measure sustainability. Maybe I could look at carbon footprint, I could look at water usage, I could look at biodiversity impact, I could look at how you treat your employees, I could look at gender diversity, racial diversity, the list is endless. And in terms of financial performance, I could look at sales growth, I could look at profitability, I could look at total shareholder return. I could do this over 5 years or 10 years or 1 year. And so even if I came up with a robust correlation that sustainable companies perform better, you need to ask yourself, well, could there have been many, many other ways of measuring sustainability and performance that the researcher did, and they only report the one that gave them the findings that you want? And so then how does a reader discern this? Because you have no idea about all the other tests that they ran. But it's to ask yourself, do you have the most natural measure of performance and sustainability? For example, McKinsey has a ton of reports which link sustainability or other things like diversity to EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. So that is one measure of performance. But the most common measure of performance is we just look at how the stock price does. And so why is that much better? Because profitability only measures the short term, yet the stock price is forward looking. Some of the best performing companies nowadays are tech firms, which don't have high current profits, but because they're expected to have higher future profits, the stock price is already encapsulating that.
Can you share the example of an investor that had come to you wanting to build a fund around some performance measure and you did the research and it wasn't there, but they went and did the fund anyway?
Yes, so this is one of the world's leading investors who I give a pseudonym to in the book. But she had heard of my research linking employee satisfaction to long-term firm performance, and she wanted to launch a fund based on diversity. And so I was really excited. I thought, okay, I could work with this leading investor. I myself am an ethnic minority, so I would like to believe that diversity pays off. And there were 24 measures of gender diversity, which was her specific lens, which I tried to correlate with performance. And I did, and I found in 22 of those 24 cases, there was sadly a negative link. Now, it was clear what I should do if I wanted to work with this investor. I could just disclose the two positive ones, but that would not be correct in terms of honesty. So I disclosed all 24, and she wasn't interested in working with me. She politely thanked me, but then moved on. I thought, well, this is going to be the end of it. And then just 6 months later, I saw her launch the fund with a big fanfare that this is backed up by scientific research showing a strong link. And I was surprised because I had done the research 24 times and not found it. And what she had found was research by another company linking diversity not to shareholder returns, which is what any investor should care about, but measures like the return on sales or the return on capital employed. It had a very specific measure of diversity. It compared boards with 3 or more women to boards with 0 women. But why is it 3 or more versus 0? Why is it not 3 or more versus 2 or fewer, 2 or more versus 1 or fewer? Or why isn't it something percentage-wise, 2/3, at least 2/3, at least 1/3 women and 2/3 men or something? It may well be that this 3 versus 0 was the only thing which worked, and so that's why they reported this. And so this matters because this fund and many other funds with the same theme, they have all underperformed. And so if you're basing this on misleading data, it doesn't matter how much of an advocate you are for the cause, and it may well be seen to be a worthy cause, but do not back up this cause with some incorrect data. Just as a police officer, you might have a high conviction that this person is guilty, and it may well be that the court has just unfairly made certain rulings that certain evidence is inadmissible. But despite how strongly you feel that is not just, it is not an excuse to then make up data or make up evidence to convict your suspect.
Yeah, it seems like a really tricky thing in financial economics. As a practitioner, people used to say that evidence-based investing was a good thing to imply things like index funds, but I found that word to become, or that phrase to become increasingly meaningless because you can find evidence to back up pretty much, or a form of evidence at least, to back up pretty much any investment strategy that you want to make a case for.
Absolutely. We like to throw around these phrases like research finds that, study proves that, but you can find a study to show whatever you want to support. So what matters is the quality of the research, and also not just to be skewed by one study, but to look at scientific consensus, which is the weight of the findings of multiple studies.
What can people do to guard against data mining?
So, as a consumer of research, is to ask, well, have you looked at the most plausible ways of measuring an input and an output? So let's say the output is performance. The most natural measure for any fund is total shareholder return. That's the measure of performance they always advertise. So if you look at return on sales, that is quite odd. And also the input. So if you're looking at 3 or more versus 0, that's strange, because what about the board with 1 or 2 women? Why are we looking at the absolute number of women on the board? Shouldn't it be a percentage? Because if a board is larger, you might expect more women than if the board was small. So just to ask yourselves, well, are there other more plausible ways of measuring this? And if there were and they're not reported, then that might raise a red flag. What the best studies will do a robustness check, which is to show, well, if we were to measure performance in this other different way, we still get the same results. If we measure diversity in this different way, we looked at percentages, not absolutes, we still find this.
Okay, so moving up the ladder, when is data evidence?
So that is when you have something like a randomized control trial. So in medicine, I have randomly assigned some people to get the drug and some people to get a placebo. Now, in real life, outside of randomized trials, you might think, well, that's pretty rare, but sometimes you do get the equivalent, which is known as a natural experiment. So what do I mean by a natural experiment? Well, a lab experiment is what I have just described, a placebo and a treatment. A natural experiment is when the separation applies naturally, perhaps because of a law change. So there was a time where, I hope I'm getting the states the right way around, where Pennsylvania passed a minimum wage, but New Jersey, which is just across the border, did not pass a minimum wage. And so it's like the New Jersey restaurants were a placebo, nothing happened. The Pennsylvania restaurants were the ones with the treatment, with the drug. And so you can compare the effect of the minimum wage on employment. And the study I cite in the book finds surprisingly the minimum wage, if anything, increased employment compared to the common perception that minimum wages are always damaging to employment. Why you compare two very similar restaurants with similar economic conditions, because they're just very close to each other. Just one is in Pennsylvania, the other's in New Jersey, and then one was affected and the other was not.
So, what does this say about evidence in financial economics, where natural experiments and RCTs, well, RCTs I don't think you can do, but natural experiments are pretty rare as well?
Is that it's actually quite difficult to get evidence which is conclusively a causal. And does this mean that, well, we can't believe anything and anything goes? No, but it's just to say that we don't want to rely on things too heavily. So absolutely the gold standard should not be causal 100% evidence. Otherwise, we could just be ignoring many other things which might be 80% true or 70% reliable. But instead, it's not to view things as black and white. It's not either completely nailed and completely invalid. Even if what you find is a correlation, that could still be useful. And indeed, some of my own papers only find correlations because I don't have a natural experiment. So one example is my work on cognitive diversity. Now, we do have natural experiments on demographic diversity, which is forcing, say, boards to have 40% of women. There is no natural experiment forcing there to be a diversity of different viewpoints. That's much harder to pass a law about. So all I have is correlations, but those correlations at least can be suggestive. They might get us 70% of the way there, even if it's not completely conclusive.
Okay, now when we have evidence, why is evidence not proof?
So let's say we've nailed causality, we've got a perfect natural experiment. That might only be true in that particular setting. It may not be universal. So what is the difference between evidence and a proof? A proof is universal. So when Archimedes proves the area of a circle, that was true not only in ancient Greece in the 3rd century BC when he did his proof, it's true in circles in 2025 in Canada today. But often when we look at evidence, it might be gathered only in one particular setting. So let me give you an example. So there was a very famous book by Angela Duckworth and a really famous TED Talk about the power of grit, the power of passion and perseverance. And what she did to show that grit mattered was she took men and women who got to West Point, which is the United States Military Academy. Now, if you get into West Point, you're not yet in the army. You have to survive a 6-week course called the Beast Barracks, which is really tough. It's mentally and physically demanding. And she wanted to see, well, what predicts survival of Beast Barracks? You might think it's physical fitness, but she found the one thing even more important than fitness was grit, which she defines as passion and perseverance. So that is striking. So grit must be so powerful if it's even more important than fitness in a physical challenge. But the problem here is something known as restriction of range. So what is that? She had a sample of already very fit people. So in order to get into West Point, you already have to be extremely fit. And maybe they had already passed the threshold level of fitness, and that's why fitness didn't matter, because everybody was already fit enough to survive Beast Barracks. Now it's something else like grit mattering. But we cannot over extrapolate from that setting of really fit people and to say, well, for the general person on the street, work on your fitness, work on your grit, not your fitness. No, for the ordinary person dreaming of joining the military, maybe he or she should work on their fitness. That's the more important thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the grit research it's not wrong, but it's right only within the specific setting in which it was conducted.
Yes, and that's true for many other studies. So a lot of studies are done on weird people. You might think, well, that's strange for me to say, call somebody weird, but weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. That's where a lot of studies take place. And some of them we can generalize. So if it's something like smoking causes cancer in Canadians, that is something where it might well apply the same to Latin Americans or Chinese people, because that's something which is to do with the sort of the body. But if it's something cultural, which is, say, the link between equality of pay and perceived fairness, there may well be different social norms. So you're never going to get a study on the particular setting that you're interested in. But again, perfect should not be the enemy of the good. We want to ask ourselves, based on logic, is this a setting which is sufficiently similar? And are there logical reasons to believe that it won't apply here? With smoking and cancer, I don't think we really need to be so specific in terms of context, but for something more cultural, behavioral, then the context may matter more.
Okay, so we've established that the truth is hard to establish. What steps do you think people should take to seek the truth when they're making an important decision? And you've mentioned busy people a few times throughout the conversation. So I guess within that context, what should people be doing?
So it's to be discerning about any evidence. And so what I have in the back of the book is just a checklist of simple questions to ask yourself following the ladder inference. So if there is a statement, is there evidence behind this, or are we just misquoting? If it's a fact, is this one anecdote, or is this here in large scale? If it's large scale data, is there alternative explanations? So it might not be a causation. And even if there is causation, what was the setting in which it was gathered? Is it different to what setting we care about? But more generally than just evaluating studies, because studies are not the only source of information, we get information from other people's opinions, is just to go out there and actively seek different viewpoints and make it clear that you are open to different viewpoints, particularly if you are a leader or in an authoritative position like a professor, where people might incorrectly assume that they should not challenge you. And when there is challenge, it may well be that you want to make it clear how much you appreciate it. So let's say you're the chair of a board, and then you're going to go ahead with a strategy, and then somebody raises an objection. You hear that objection and you discuss it open-mindedly, but people think that even though that objection is well-founded, the benefits outweigh the costs, and you still go ahead. Maybe you should go to that person afterwards, or maybe you should do this publicly to the rest of the board and say, I really appreciate you sharing your different viewpoint. Even though we still went ahead with the decision, we will bear your concerns in mind when we execute the strategy. And in the future, if you have concerns, please continue to voice them. Now, if you had not done that, what might the dissenter think? He or she might think, well, I had to sacrifice my political capital to raise this concern. I may have annoyed the people who proposed the strategy. I delayed the meeting by half an hour, and I didn't change the decision anyway. So in the future, I'm just going to self-censor. So if you make it clear that you do encourage different viewpoints, then this does mean that you're going to still get differences of opinion, and you're going to get closer to the truth.
What about at a societal level? What should we be teaching people and thinking about to embed these ideas that you're talking about in our everyday lives?
It's to teach the value of critical thinking. And you might think, well, at a societal level, is this feasible? Can we teach this in schools? And I think we can. Even though, yes, statistics we might only learn when we're 16, but what I'm highlighting is statistics is not about just numbers. There is not a single equation like that. What statistics is about is looking at alternative explanations. It's about being discerning. So just like we teach a kid, don't accept sweets from strangers, there's an alternative explanation for why the stranger is giving you sweets. It's a nefarious one. We also teach kids, well, not directly, but when they read murder mysteries, they learn quickly that it's not the most obvious suspect who committed the murder. They look for alternative suspects. Given that kids are able to establish and grasp that, I don't think it's unrealistic to teach them the power of thinking about alternative explanations. And this is valuable not just for the interpretation of data and statistics, but more civil discourse. What we see right now is sometimes people cancelling those with different viewpoints. We see echo chambers. We see a lot of mental health issues when a student might be cancelled by the rest of his or her peers. But if we highlight that even on issues that we think are pretty black and white, there may well be two sides to it, then we are able to encourage people to have a greater respect for opinions that might differ from ourselves.
Man, accepting candy from strangers as an analogy to reading data that confirms your prior beliefs is pretty good.
Yeah, and it's actually not too far-fetched because this is indeed why things are so appealing. So just like candy is appealing, we want to accept it. We don't want to ask the question. We simply would like to believe that study and to consume it. To consume it, consuming knowledge, just like you want to consume the candy.